So the question was, what's the way forward with all these problems and issues, etc., and differences between countries? So what should we do? I mean, for example, you said something on strengthening research, strengthening governments. These are all nice things to do, but can we do anything about that? There's no one who wants to answer that question.
Are you happy to say something?
Yeah. You have. Go ahead.
The question. So for me, what is really essential is that whatever resources, whether it's resources for research or for development assistance, is that they flow through a government system, and that governments have like decision power over what is actually being invested in and where.
I completely agree, but how do we achieve that?
Well,
that's my point.
Okay, so working in the bank, I mean, there's various degrees, but like I said, the bank takes it. I don't want to be an advocate for the World Bank. I know there are many issues with that agency as well, but the money flows through a Minister of Finance, right? We do not procure anything on behalf of a government. If they want to procure services, they do that themselves. And I think the more all donors do that or go through a mechanism like the bank, the more you strengthen the actual government system. If you see what I showed on Nigeria, you have a Ministry of Health in Nigeria that has control over 10% of the health budget. How can you do a planning or a strategy or anything meaningful if you don't have power over the resources?
Let me put it a little bit critical then. A lot of governments are not functioning very well, as you will know. So how do you solve that? Because otherwise, I mean, it's very often the idea that others outside the government should push things because the government is not functioning very well. No answer?
No, I think that's...
There's no answer to that.
No, I think that's a chicken-egg problem. I think if you don't strengthen a system, it's obviously not going to get any better because you create incentives to take it out. So I think you have to use a system if you want it to get better.
Okay, your turn.
I'll add my 2 cents. First, I'd like to say to both Ellen and Sridhar, thank you very much for your incredibly interesting, insightful, and thought-provoking presentations. I learned a lot. But listening to this as a lawyer and wearing that hat, what intrigues me is the incredible frustration we have over donors, over the lack of these actors, and the lack of accountability. And to me, that seems to be the common thread. There's a lack of accountability, and we have to ask why. And I think Tobias asked earlier, you know, what's your next jump? How are you going to do? What are you going to do tomorrow? And I think we're at a critical point as a civilization, as a society, in how we function, how we work. And our legal order is coming under challenge. And we're seeing that in all directions at all levels. And what Sridhar brought up, these questions of ethics, they're a function of donors. And why do we have donors? Why do we have this incredibly powerful system of donors, like Wellcome Trust, like Gates? It's because it's a blind spot in our international legal system. The system of law that we're functioning in with all the governments, World Bank, the UN, was created in post-World War II and created fundamentally to guard against wars again. So our cooperation was only so far as it helped us achieve our own self-interested ends, but nothing further. There wasn't a sense of interconnectedness, and there wasn't really a desire. So the blind spot, and an apparent one in global health, is how do you help poorer countries that have diseases when your only obligations are to your own citizens? Your only obligations are very vertical, and you will only help another country insofar as it protects yourself. So global health in its most traditional sense, from the sanitary conferences of the early 20th century, was really based on containing pandemics insofar as it helped your trade and economy. It wasn't for helping the health and well-being of other countries. So the idea of using global health as a basis for the well-being and development is a charitable notion based on voluntary goodwill. And when you leave something to voluntary goodwill and charitability, there's no accountability, there's no transparency, and there's a lot of latitude for donors to choose and cherry pick what they choose to do and to have these very singular, narrow agendas.
What do you think?
That fragmentation is what we're trying to get against when we have these interconnected problems of just transition.
Okay. What do you think about it? You are more critical, I think.
What do I think about what?
About the way forward. forward that we are discussing. I mean, is global health simply a career for a lot of people? And we should strengthen the governments and stop with that.
Yeah. So I guess what's odd for me in my, I don't know what I'm understanding and hearing, but solving a country's health system is not our mandate.
I completely agree with you, yes.
Okay? So it's not my job to solve country X's problem. I think the question is, what is the way forward as individuals in our capacities working in this area, right? So she very clearly identified her institution's capacities, what she does, what she thinks is the solution. So the way that when people ask me, well, what should I do? I said, well, what can you do, right? What is it that you are able to do? And one of the most important things is, when we think about ethics, is that, if you were walking by a river and someone is drowning, you don't walk by, you help. But if a child is walking by, you don't say your obligation is to help this drowning child. So your ethical obligation of what do I do depends on what you're capable of actually doing. And you should be maxing out what your capacities are, right? So some of us can talk in multiple languages and can travel, and we are sort of advocating. Other people can move institutions, right? So we would say, can you move your institution to do this better? And so therefore do it. That's, so your question of what's the way forward depends on who you are, it depends on what you can do, depends on what you want to do, and do we even agree what the goal is that we're trying to achieve, right? So I think those are all, sort of questions that people should consider.
Thank you. Are there countries that have solved this problem? I know one, but I ask the question to you.
What's the problem?
Well, the issue that they take responsibility themselves completely and say, we don't want the donors anymore. We don't want this involvement anymore.
Yeah,
Are there countries doing that?
But we didn't say donors were the problem.
No.
We didn't. We said
put it provocative.
Yeah. No. Okay.
No, I was going to go in the same line as you. I don't think the reality is that without external investment in health, many countries are much worse off than they are now. We are not in a macro-fiscal situation now where countries can raise sufficient domestic resources for health. That is a very, like development assistance is a necessity in many countries. So it's not, to that part of your question, I think that we have to accept. Now, the thing is, are you going to use that money to actually really to just provide services in the short term? And in some countries, when conflict, that's the only thing that you can do. But in many other countries, make sure that you empower a government to help them take charge. I have not worked with any government, really, who doesn't want change, who doesn't ambition change, and who's not very capable at the high levels of imagining what the change should look like. But often in ministries, people are just disempowered because of a lot of other conflicts in their countries and because of the international architecture. So, if I think I worked in Ethiopia for some time, you have a very strong government that's very tough on the donors, obliges them to the table and says, look, it's our way or the highway. And that have really, but even then I've seen challenges with donors sort of not playing that game. So it is very difficult to be in a position where you need that external money because you need it to finance part of your system. And at the same time, you want to enforce behavior change. That's a very difficult thing to manage. So a lot of these ministers are in very, I would say, vulnerable positions.
Okay.
It doesn't answer your question, but I hope it gives...
No, it doesn't answer it. There's no answer, of course. Go ahead, please.
Well, I'd like to go back to the example of climate change because it's very much not dissimilar to some of the challenges in global health. And in climate change, what you see is this evolving notion of common but differentiated responsibilities based on respective capabilities. Very long, and not a great acronym either. But what it means is that we are all connected. We all have to contribute to the solution, but the way we contribute will be different. And that difference is based on a responsibility and what we can contribute. And I think global health could benefit from a model like that in many ways, because we're very much dependent, as I said, on the goodwill of governments and donors, private donors. And that's precarious. And that can change radically depending on the election, depending on, governments. And so to have that precarity without any transparency either, without any accountability on who and how countries will be helped, and as well to not have a partnership between the donors that is really two-way and the recipients, creates these unethical, uneven power balances and does not actually go towards a common goal because it's fragmented and they're not bound by the same system. So when we look towards a future in global health, we have to see that it can't be what it was in the 20th century based on tropical medicine, based on containing the diseases of those foreigners and to ensure our own prosperity. It has to be a different framework, and that framework has to come with a different legal system and institutional change. And from here, I think we can learn in climate change. We can learn in the transformations we're seeing happening there in terms of how they're viewing a transformation from fossil fuels to a greener economy in terms of a transition towards a regenerative and less exploitative economy.
Okay. You wanted to say something.
I always want to say something.
No, of course, go ahead, but that's why you're here.
So, there's a colleague of mine who used to be head of population at the World Bank, Adey Soji, I can't remember his sort of full name. He's just written a book. He's left the World Bank, and he's basically has written an incredible book that I reviewed in The Lancet. And his solution is donors need to stop funding poor countries because poor countries need to take responsibility for the health of their own people, right?
Interesting.
So, he basically says, we'll give 8 years of runway so that it's not a sudden death, but that this is going to happen. Because there's two things going on. On the one hand, you've got a donor, what he calls the donor industry of the complex that keeps getting
careers.
bigger. And then you've got the lack of responsibility, neglect, corruption and stuff. And so to break it, what you need to do is stop this so that people take responsibility. That's one solution, and I don't know whether that's the right way. But I think that is on the table as an opportunity to say, how do you deal with both of these two problems, the neglect and corruption and poor stuff, and how do you sort of, on the one hand, stop this perennial more and more sort of work for the funding agencies and donors and capacity building agencies, et cetera. I think that's right. So the second thing is that I think that the Minister of Finance should not be the most powerful person in a government. And that's exactly what's happening at this point. I think that the Minister of Health is becoming useless, and most global health organizations are actually going to the Minister of Finance because they know that the Ministry of Health actually doesn't do anything because she has no money. And so I think that there's something going on here about how do we think about financing health, but also not making it become another ministry that everybody wants to get a position to, right? So once they're in position, and you might be able to work with them, but the Ministry of Finance is already quite a significant role in many countries, and I think adding more money to it, particularly with health, actually just adds to the power imbalance within the government, and also I think there's lots of other practical political problems in it. But I think we should talk about this some more in terms of how do you actually get the government to own the health work, but also not make it into certain people, into the gatekeepers of all the funding that actually, determines whether people live or die.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, we have a few minutes left. Are there people that want to ask a provoking question to the panel? And no? Yes? Yes, you want. Oh, okay. Yeah, you haven't. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I haven't said anything yet.
No, but that's why I think it should be your turn.
Yes. Thank you very much. Really extremely interesting talks today, and I'm really happy I came. So, by background, just to give a few words, I'm a gynecologist, and I grew up between the two worlds, I would say. I grew up partially in the south, in Sierra Leone, and in Germany, so these are my parents, and my education was also in both worlds. And for the past years, I was working in global health, maternal global health, as I'm a gynecologist. So especially the last talk triggered some memories from me because I was also working in Sierra Leone partially. And I did get in touch with the PBF system, and also after the PBF was then finished, as then receiving comments like, oh no, I'm not taking that data anymore, that PVF system has finished, so we're not doing that. So there is also some effect happening once the money runs out, even though PVF might be good for the time being, but then afterwards, what happens? It's not really sustainable. At the point were my thoughts. And then again, thinking of the universal health coverage, sure, we would like insurance because we want every individual to have its personal human right to health being fulfilled. But how do you get that? You need some sort of coverage. Insurance seems to be a good solution, but how does that work? The structures in rural West Africa, at least, are very different. You don't have the responsibility of the individual in the rural context. You would actually go to your chief, your town chief, or some senior person of your community, and that one is the one responsible for what happens to you. So the structures that we have in Europe, or maybe in the US, in the Western world, are just not the ones that apply in a rural community where actually the problems lie that we are currently thinking about. We here, there as well, everywhere people are trying to say, how do we make it a better world? But then I was very much triggered about your experience in 1996. So my question is, where is actually this other room? Because we here, most of us, I'm now having some ideas of people here, but I don't know you, but most of us might be mainly from the Western countries and not having the direct experience of living in a sub-Saharan African country as a rural person, having direct contact to people from there, feeling as them. So where is the other room? Where are the activists? Where can we get in touch and hear the words of the activists of the South so that we can actually act on what they want and how they would think solutions can be put together? And then I think the One Health is actually a point of where we have to start, saying everyone has to have a word, everyone needs to come to the table, because right now we're thinking of how do we find solutions from our perspective, which doesn't work.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that HIV/AIDS is an interesting example because you raised it, but I mean it was indeed activism was coming from the gay community, very strong, and then it changed, but it also was much weaker, and it had a voice, but a small voice, and that's very difficult to change. That's very difficult. I can put this question to the panel, but I give you the last, if you are brief. You have to, because otherwise
be brief.
Thrown out of the theater.
Okay, sorry. Let's have a totally opposite solution, perhaps. How about being piggybacking on the most horrible forces in the world? Like in West Africa, the United States has spent an enormous amount of money on building all kinds of labs to keep the pandemic at the African continent. And the second thing is that they have identified a number of countries throughout the Sahel where they expect extremist threats will come from. And they have decided, and it is 2 years ago, and I don't think this next government is going to do, but anyway, they said, let's put our money in health education and start using soft power to avoid extremism from building up there. Now, we, as the global health world, are always keeping ourselves very far from those kind of militaristic adventures. My plea would be, let's use it. Let's be opportunistic. Let's use that money to create something that in the end works. And I think, my question to you, would that be a nice definition of utilitarianism in ethical point of view?
I'm not sure that we can easily answer that question because we have no power over the money at all. But does any one of you want to say something on this topic? Or you will be no?
So the answer is no.
No. Okay, very clear. Thank you. Tobias, you have the last word, and then we have to stop. Here. Yeah.
Just the suggestion, indeed, coming back to your question, of changing this whole thing into a military urgency instead of a health urgency. That was already done by Museveni in Uganda 25 years ago. When he came into power, he had been confronted with HIV/AIDS with his generals and his top people who were in the bush fighting against the previous government. He found out during their trainings in Cuba that 1/3 of his staff was HIV positive. So he saw this as a military problem and not as a health problem. So what did Museveni do? He established the Joint Clinical Research Center, which is still existing in Kampala. Joint means joint between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Defense, they have money. And that was, in fact, a brilliant idea. And it worked for quite a while. In the beginning, he was one of the champions fighting HIV. Unfortunately, of course, he has changed and he's not like he used to be. But I do think that there is something in it to consider maybe global health more from a global health security point of view, and take that agenda and see whether we can link up to that. So these are my last words to you, and then of course
I will have the last word. Oh yes. I will have the last word. So I'm Constance. I'm the chair of the board of the Amsterdam Institute for Global Health and Development. And first of all, thank you all for joining us. I think this was a fantastic session. I'm very grateful to all the speakers, including Nikes, who's not here, and to Roel, our moderator, for joining us. I think I was very impressed. I was very impressed with the discussion because we did discuss current questions and issues in global health, or whatever we call what we're doing. And so tremendous food for thought, I must say, in this discussion. And not only that, also clear indication of how to, or suggestions for moving forward, which is always very helpful, because it's a bit frustrating if you have discussions that end up with, well, we have no clue how to move on. But we have some, I think we have some ideas and thoughts. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all. And yes, we have. Are you going to distribute, Matt?
You will do it.
Oh, you will hand them. Thank you very much. We will do that together. Join me. So thank you very much for joining us. These are our souvenirs. Thank you very much. It was fantastic. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. And of course, thank you, Roel. But not only that, thank you very much, Leah, Matt, and everybody else at AGG who organized this, who will get there, who will also get, and Tobias, thank you very much. So I think it's time for drinks, and we certainly need some drinks after these serious discussions, so let's go and have them. Thank you very much.